You open your banking app, and the balance sits there like a quiet accusation. Rent climbed again this month. Your hours feel longer while the paycheck stays flat. You wonder why the system still seems stacked against the people who actually work. But the real answer is far stranger. 675 years ago, a bacterium arrived in Europe and rewrote the rules of power, money, and survival so thoroughly that you are still living inside its consequences. The Black Death did not merely kill. It rearranged the relationship between those who owned land and those who worked it, and that rearrangement never fully reversed. Between 1347 and 1352, the plague swept from the steppes of Central Asia across the Mediterranean and into every corner of Europe. Ships carried it into harbors. Fleas carried it into homes. Within 5 years, the continent looked different. Historian Ole Benedicto spent decades assembling local mortality records from hundreds of parishes and towns. His synthesis points to a death rate near 60% across large parts of the continent. Entire villages emptied. Fields went fallow. The living walked past houses whose doors no longer opened. Churches that once rang for weddings now rang only for the dead. In some places, the mortality was even higher. In others, it was lighter. The variation itself became part of the story. Yet the bodies themselves tell a more precise story. Bioarchaeologist Sharon DeWitt has examined the skeletons recovered from the East Smithfield Emergency Burial Ground in London and from other medieval cemeteries. The dead were not a random sample of the population. People who had already suffered childhood malnutrition, whose teeth showed developmental stress, whose bones carried the marks of hard physical labor, died at higher rates. Frailty mattered. Poverty mattered. The plague selected. It preferred the already weakened. Those who entered the epidemic already compromised left it first. When so many workers vanished, the remaining ones suddenly held something rare. Labor became scarce. Land became relatively abundant. Real wages began to climb. In England, they rose 20 to 40% within a generation. Peasants who had once been bound by custom and coercion could now demand higher pay, better food, and the freedom to leave a harsh lord. Serfdom, the legal system that tied people to the soil, began to crack across Western Europe. Lords who once commanded labor by right now had to bargain for it. Some tried to freeze wages by law. The laws failed. Market pressure proved stronger than statute. Historian Samuel Cohn has traced how these shifts went far beyond wages. The sudden drop in population reduced inequality for nearly a century in many regions. The share of wealth held by the richest tenth fell sharply. New forms of self-government appeared in towns that had suffered heavy losses. People negotiated more. They questioned authority more. The psychological weight of mass death also altered how communities thought about charity, about the afterlife, and about what a human life was worth. Survivors wrote of a world that felt both emptier and more possible. Rituals changed. Attitudes toward time and work changed. The old certainties no longer held. This was not simple recovery. It was transformation. In the West, the plague accelerated the end of feudal obligations and the rise of a wage economy. In parts of Eastern Europe, the opposite occurred. Landowners responded to labor shortages by tightening controls, creating a second serfdom that lasted centuries longer. The same demographic shock produced divergent paths depending on the political institutions already in place. Geography and prior power structures decided whether scarcity liberated workers or bound them more tightly. The Black Death did not create a single outcome. It revealed and amplified the institutions that already existed. You can still feel the echo. When a modern pandemic thins the workforce, the same basic pressure appears. Employers who once held every advantage suddenly discover that workers can walk away. Wages rise in scarce sectors. Bargaining power tilts, if only temporarily. Inequality conversations sharpen. The medieval pattern repeats in miniature because the underlying logic never changed. Scarcity of labor forces a renegotiation of the social contract. The tools are different. The pressure is the same. You feel it every time you decide whether the job is still worth the cost. Inheritance laws adjusted when so many heirs died at once. Family structures shifted towards smaller, more nuclear units in some regions. The value placed on skilled work increased because skills had become expensive to replace. Even the later divergence between northwestern Europe and the rest of the continent, the long economic rise that eventually produced the industrial world, has been linked by economic historians to the institutional changes set in motion after 1348. Labor scarcity rewarded societies that could attract and retain free workers. Those societies pulled ahead. None of this means the plague was a gift. It was a catastrophe that ended lives by the tens of millions and left survivors traumatized. Children grew up without parents. Whole crafts disappeared for a generation. Memory of the dead shaped the living for decades. Yet the survivors inherited a world in which their labor carried more weight than it had before. That weight has never completely disappeared. It simply changed its form. It moved from the manor field into the wage contract, from the village assembly into the modern labor market. Look again at the number in your banking app. The pressure you feel when rent rises faster than pay. The quiet calculation every worker makes about whether to stay or leave. Those calculations sit inside a longer history. 675 years ago, a microscopic organism killed enough people that the survivors could demand more. The demand never fully went away, it only changed shape. You are still negotiating with the Black Death.